The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Dran stood on the rooftop of the research facility, his eyes tracing the arc of the distant stars. He often found solace here, in the quiet of the night, when the rest of the world seemed to slow down. The stars, vast and endless, had always fascinated him. They were a reminder of how small Earth was in the grand scheme of the universe, yet how much potential lay within its inhabitants. It had been 3 months since the first contact with the Verigan, an advanced alien species from the distant star system of Varys. They had sent ambassadors to Earth not for conquest or war, but for knowledge. They came to observe, to study, to learn, and perhaps, in time, to find ways to collaborate with humanity. The program had been launched under the auspices of both the United Nations and the Intergalactic Council. It was supposed to be a peaceful exchange, a way to bridge the gap between Earth and the stars. Dran had been selected as one of the first human researchers to interact with the Verigan. A linguist by trade, he had spent years studying alien languages, decoding their customs, and trying to understand their ways. He wasn't the type to jump into the limelight, preferring the quiet solace of his books and his work. But this mission, this opportunity to meet beings from another world, was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. "Dre, are you up here again?" A soft, melodic voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Turning, Dran saw her, Zavanna. Her name, though strange and foreign on his tongue, had already become a part of his world. She was tall, far taller than most humans, with bioluminescent skin that shimmered in hues of lavender and soft blue under the fading sunlight. Her features were sharp, elegant, alien, yet beautiful. Her eyes, deep and reflective, seemed to hold entire galaxies within them, and when she looked at him, it was as though she could peer into the very core of his being. "I was just watching the stars," Dran replied, his voice warm yet cautious. "I find it peaceful up here." Zavanna smiled, a faint curve of her lips that was both mysterious and inviting. "It is beautiful, isn't it? The vastness of the universe, so many worlds, so much to discover." She moved closer to him, her presence imposing yet graceful. Dran was used to her proximity by now, but there was always an air of tension when she was around, not because she was intimidating, far from it, but because he often found himself lost in the way she looked at him, in the way she spoke, in the way she made him feel like the world was both vast and incredibly small at the same time. "I've been reading your reports," she continued, her voice soft but clear. "The way humans think about the stars, the way you interpret the unknown, it's fascinating." Dran smiled, though there was an edge of unease in his expression. "It's what I do. I study languages, cultures, anything I can find that can help us understand each other better." Zavanna tilted her head slightly, her long silver hair catching the last rays of the sun. "And what do you think of us? Of the Verigan?" He hesitated for a moment. The Verigan were unlike anything he had ever imagined. They were far more advanced than humans in terms of technology, culture, and intelligence. But there was something about them that made him feel small, insignificant even. It wasn't arrogance or superiority. It was a quiet confidence that came with knowing they were at the top of the galactic food chain. "You are remarkable," he said finally. "You're so different from us, and yet there are similarities. It's fascinating to think about the possibilities of our two species working together." Zavanna's gaze softened, her eyes searching his face. "But do you think we could ever truly understand each other? Could humans ever understand the Verigan way of life, of thought?" Dran nodded slowly. "I think we can. It's just going to take time." Zavanna didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer, her tall frame casting a long shadow across the rooftop. The warmth of her presence was undeniable, and Dran felt a subtle pull toward her, an attraction that was hard to ignore. He had noticed it from the very beginning, the way his heart seemed to beat a little faster when she was near, the way his thoughts seemed to scatter when her voice filled the air. But Savannah was not just another human woman. She was from another world, with an entirely different set of rules and expectations, especially when it came to relationships and physical connection. The Verigan, from what Dran had learned, valued logic above all else. Their relationships were based on efficiency, on biological compatibility, on the cold calculation of genetics and reproduction. Love, as humans understood it, was a foreign concept to them. Still, Dran couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Savannah than just an alien diplomat. There was a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability that she rarely showed to anyone. And when she looked at him, he couldn't help but feel as if she were trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand her. "Savannah," he said, his voice low, tentative. "What do you think of humans? Of us?" Her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then she sighed softly. "You're different from what I expected. Your culture, your emotions, your connections with each other, it's all so complicated." "Complicated?" Dran asked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yes," Savannah said with a light laugh. "You humans seem to base everything on emotion. It's not just the way you think. No, it's the way you feel. You let your hearts guide you, not just your minds." Dran considered this, his mind turning over her words. "I suppose that's true. We tend to make decisions based on what we feel, not just what we think is logical." "Exactly," Savannah said, her voice tinged with something like curiosity. "And yet, despite all that emotion, you still manage to survive. You form bonds, relationships, you create families, even when it might not make sense to others." Dran frowned slightly. "What do you mean it doesn't make sense?" Savannah hesitated, her gaze flicking to the horizon as though she were choosing her words carefully. "Our species, we do not understand how you can form such attachments, how you can prioritize one person, one relationship, over others. It's inefficient from our point of view. Yet here you are, on Earth, interacting with humans," Dran pointed out, "learning about our ways." Savannah smiled, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Yes, learning. But I still wonder, Dran, do you think there's something between us that could work? Something beyond what our species would consider logical?" The question hung in the air between them, and Dran felt his heart race. He had wondered the same thing. Could there be something between them? Something more than just a diplomatic exchange? Could they find common ground in a world so different from their own? "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I'd like to find out." Savannah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a graceful movement, she stepped closer, her voice a whisper in the evening air. "Perhaps we will." The two stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken words settling between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The following day saw Savannah and Dran spending more time together. Their conversations grew deeper, their silences more comfortable. While they continued to exchange knowledge as part of the official program, their discussions often wandered into personal territory. Dran sharing stories of his childhood, his struggles, and his fascination with the stars, and Savannah revealing glimpses of Verigan life and her own challenges as a diplomat. One afternoon, Savannah invited Dran to the Verigan quarters, a sleek, organic structure that looked more grown than built, its walls pulsating faintly with a bioluminescent glow. The air inside was cool, almost too cold for Dran's liking, and filled with a faint floral aroma. He followed Savannah down a corridor that seemed to twist and shift as they walked, her silver hair catching the light like strands of liquid metal. "This is where we conduct our research," she explained, leading him into a circular room filled with floating holographic displays. Each of us is tasked with understanding a specific aspect of your species. For me, it's your relationships." Dran blinked, surprised. "Relationships? You mean romantic ones?" "Among other things," Savannah replied. Her tone was neutral, but her gaze was piercing. "We are fascinated by how deeply your emotions influence your connections. It's unlike anything we've encountered before." Dran laughed nervously, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure we're the best role models for that. Our relationships can be messy." "Messy, yes," Savannah agreed, tilting her head, "but also profound. Your species bonds in ways that defy logic, ways that even we, with all our advancements, cannot replicate." Her words hung in the air, heavy with curiosity, and something else Dran couldn't quite place. He shifted awkwardly, feeling the weight of her gaze. "So, what have you learned so far?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. Savannah's lips curved into a faint smile. "That humans are unpredictable. Your emotions, your desires, they are difficult to quantify. But there is beauty in that unpredictability. It's compelling." Her admission caught him off guard. For all her logical explanations and scientific detachment, there was a sincerity in her voice that felt deeply personal. It was as if she wasn't just studying human relationships. She was trying to understand something within herself. "Do you not experience emotions at all?" Dran asked, his curiosity piqued. Savannah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "We do, but not in the way you do. Our emotions are subdued, controlled. They do not dictate our actions or decisions. We value efficiency, compatibility, and logic above all else." Dran nodded slowly. "But doesn't that, I don't know, feel empty?" Savannah looked up at him, her eyes glimmering with an intensity that took his breath away. "Sometimes it does." The admission was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a confession. Dran felt a pang of sympathy for her, for the struggle she seemed to be grappling with. He wanted to say something to bridge the gap between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out his hand, brushing against hers. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it was enough to make Savannah freeze. Her gaze snapped to his, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else, something he couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, pulling his hand back. "I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," Savannah interrupted, her voice steady but her expression unreadable. "I'm just not used to such gestures." Dran nodded, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "Right, of course, sorry." Savannah studied him for a moment longer before turning away, her movements graceful yet tense. "You humans place a lot of importance on physical touch, don't you?" "It's one way we show connection," Dran explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not always romantic or intimate. It can be comforting too, a way to say, 'I'm here for you.'" Savannah considered this, her head tilted in that curious way of hers. "Fascinating." The conversation shifted after that, returning to safer topics, but the moment lingered in Dran's mind, a seed of something he couldn't quite name. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Savannah had looked at him, the way her voice had softened when she spoke of emotions and connection. That evening, as he sat alone in his quarters, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. Savannah was so different from anyone he had ever met, alien in every sense of the word. And yet there was something deeply human about her struggles, her curiosity, her desire to understand. The next day, Savannah sought him out again, this time at the research facility's botanical garden. The garden was a blend of earth and Verigan flora, a testament to the collaboration between their species. Savannah seemed at ease among the vibrant colours and alien blooms, her bioluminescent skin glowing softly in the sunlight. "Dran," she called, her voice carrying across the garden. Dran turned to her, a smile tugging at his lips, and Savannah approached him, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about our conversation." Dran raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Which part?" Savannah hesitated, then spoke with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I want to understand more about touch, about connection." The statement caught him off guard, and he felt his heart skip a beat. "You mean you want to experience it?" "Yes," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "If I am to understand your species, I need to experience what you value most. Will you help me?" Dran hesitated, his mind racing. He wanted to say yes, but he also knew the implications of such a request. This wasn't just a scientific experiment, it was personal, intimate, and if he wasn't careful, it could complicate everything. "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice low. "This isn't something to take lightly." Savannah stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "I am sure." Her confidence was both intimidating and alluring, and Dran felt himself drawn to her despite his reservations. Slowly, he reached out his hand, hovering just above hers. "Okay," he said softly, "but let's take it one step at a time." As their hands touched, Dran felt a jolt of electricity shoot through him, not literal, but emotional. Savannah's skin was cool, almost cold, but it warmed under his touch. Her gaze remained steady, her expression calm, but he could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe even vulnerability. "How does it feel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Strange," Savannah admitted, "but not unpleasant." Dran smiled, his nerves easing slightly. "Good, that's a start." They stood there for a moment, their hands entwined, the world around them fading into the background. It was a small gesture, a simple act of connection, but it felt like the beginning of something far greater. The days following Savannah's request were filled with a mix of cautious exploration and growing tension between her and Dran. Their connection, once purely intellectual, was now laced with a quiet intensity. They found themselves seeking each other out more frequently, whether to discuss Verigan and human culture, or simply to share a meal in companionable silence. Yet beneath their blossoming relationship lay an undercurrent of uncertainty. Savannah's stoic demeanour often masked her true thoughts, while Dran wrestled with his growing feelings for her. The boundary between study and something more personal had become blurred, and neither knew how to navigate it. One evening, Savannah invited Dran to her quarters again. This time, the atmosphere was different, warmer, more inviting. A faint hum filled the room, emanating from Verigan crystals embedded in the walls. They pulsed gently with a soothing light that seemed to respond to Savannah's presence. "These crystals are part of our living structures," she explained as Dran examined one of them. "They attune themselves to the emotional states of those within. On Varys, they help create harmony in our homes." Dran nodded, fascinated. "So they can sense emotions?" "Yes," Savannah replied, "though they are not as adept at interpreting human feelings. Your emotional spectrum is far too chaotic." Dran chuckled, leaning against the wall. "Sounds about right. We're not exactly known for our consistency." Savannah studied him, her silver eyes reflecting the soft glow of the crystals. "And yet, it is your unpredictability that intrigues me most." There was a sincerity in her voice that made Dran's heart skip a beat. He met her gaze, and for a moment the air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking about what you said," Savannah continued, her tone quieter now. "About touch, about connection. It's difficult for me to comprehend, but I wish to try again." Dran hesitated, his pulse quickening. "Savannah, are you sure? I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "You haven't," she said firmly, stepping closer. "I'm curious. I want to understand." Her honesty disarmed him. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Savannah's skin was as cool as before, but this time Dran noticed a subtle warmth spreading beneath his touch. It was as if her body was responding, acclimating to his presence. "How does it feel now?" he asked softly. Savannah tilted her head, considering. Different, less foreign. Encouraged, Dran took her hand in his, marvelling at how delicate yet strong it felt. Savannah's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or even a hint of vulnerability. "It's not just about physical sensation," Dran said, his voice gentle. "Touch can mean many things: comfort, affection, trust." Zana's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Trust. That is something we Virishan value highly, though we express it differently." "How so?" Dran asked, genuinely curious. "For us, trust is demonstrated through actions, not emotions," Savannah explained. "We do not rely on words or gestures to convey our intentions. Instead, we prove our loyalty through our deeds." Dran nodded, understanding. "That's not so different from humans. But sometimes words and gestures are just as important. They're how we show what we feel." "Feelings," Zana murmured, her gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. "Such an alien concept." For a moment they stood in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the crystals around them. Dran could feel the weight of Zana's struggles, the way she was grappling with something so far removed from her own experience. He wanted to comfort her, to ease her uncertainty, but he wasn't sure how. "Savannah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to feel. You don't have to understand everything all at once." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Slowly, she reached out with her free hand, brushing her fingers against his cheek. The gesture was tentative, almost shy, but it sent a shiver down Dran's spine. "Is this right?" Savannah asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Dran smiled, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her question. "There's no right or wrong way to connect, Zana. It's about what feels true to you." Her touch lingered for a moment longer before she pulled back, her expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Dran. Your species is more complex than I anticipated." "We're full of surprises," he said, his tone light but his gaze serious. "And I think you're just beginning to scratch the surface." The next day, Dran found himself more distracted than usual. Zana's touch, her words, the way she had looked at him. It all lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, though that was undeniable. It was the way she challenged him, the way she made him question things he had taken for granted. Savannah wasn't just an alien. She was a mirror, reflecting parts of himself he hadn't known were there. When they met again that evening, the tension between them had grown. Zana seemed more reserved, her usual confidence tempered by something softer, more hesitant. Dran could feel it too, a sense that they were standing on the edge of something neither fully understood. "I've been reviewing my research," Savannah said, her voice steady, but her gaze distant. "There is still much I do not understand about human relationships, about intimacy." Dran nodded, his throat dry. "It's not something you can learn from books or data. It's experiential." "Experiential," Savannah repeated, her tone thoughtful. "Then perhaps it is time for me to experience more." The weight of her words settled over them, heavy with implication. Dran swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Savannah," he began, his voice faltering. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," she interrupted, her gaze locking onto his, "that I trust you, and I wish to explore this connection further with you." Her declaration took his breath away. For a moment, he could only stare at her, his mind racing. He wanted to say yes, to take the leap she was offering, but he also knew the risks. Their worlds were so different, their expectations so alien. Could they truly bridge that gap? "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Zavanna nodded, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with determination. "I am." Dran took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Then let's take it slow, one step at a time." Zana's lips curved into a faint smile. "I would expect nothing less from you, Dran." As they stood together in the soft glow of the Verigan crystals, the fragile thread between them grew stronger. It was a tentative, uncertain bond, but it was real, and for the first time both of them felt the possibility of something extraordinary. Zavanna and Dran's relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. What began as a tentative exploration of touch and mean many things: comfort, affection, trust. Zana's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Trust, that is something we Verisian value highly, though we express it differently." "How so?" Dran asked, genuinely curious. "For us, trust is demonstrated through actions, not emotions," Zavanna explained. "We do not rely on words or gestures to convey our intentions. Instead, we prove our loyalty through our deeds." Dran nodded, understanding. "That's not so different from humans. But sometimes words and gestures are just as important. They're how we show what we feel." "Feelings," Zana murmured, her gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. Such an alien concept. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the crystals around them. Dran could feel the weight of Zana's struggles, the way she was grappling with something so far removed from her own experience. He wanted to comfort her, to ease her uncertainty, but he wasn't sure how. "Zavanna," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to feel. You don't have to understand everything all at once." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Slowly, she reached out with her free hand, brushing her fingers against his cheek. The gesture was tentative, almost shy, but it sent a shiver down Dran's spine. "Is this right?" Zavanna asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Dran smiled, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her question. "There's no right or wrong way to connect, Zana. It's about what feels true to you." Her touch lingered for a moment longer before she pulled back, her expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Dran. Your species is more complex than I anticipated." "We're full of surprises," he said, his tone light but his gaze serious. "And I think you're just beginning to scratch the surface." The next day, Dran found himself more distracted than usual. Zana's touch, her words, the way she had looked at him. It all lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, though that was undeniable. It was the way she challenged him, the way she made him question things he had taken for granted. Zavanna wasn't just an alien, she was a mirror, reflecting parts of himself he hadn't known were there. When they met again that evening, the tension between them had grown. Zana seemed more reserved, her usual confidence tempered by something softer, more hesitant. Dran could feel it too, a sense that they were standing on the edge of something neither fully understood. "I've been reviewing my research," Zavanna said, her voice steady but her gaze distant. "There is still much I do not understand about human relationships, about intimacy." Dran nodded, his throat dry. "It's not something you can learn from books or data. It's experiential." "Experiential," Zavanna repeated, her tone thoughtful. "Then perhaps it is time for me to experience more." The weight of her words settled over them, heavy with implication. Dran swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Zavanna," he began, his voice faltering. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," she interrupted, her gaze locking onto his, "that I trust you, and I wish to explore this connection further with you." Her declaration took his breath away. For a moment, he could only stare at her, his mind racing. He wanted to say yes, to take the leap she was offering, but he also knew the risks. Their worlds were so different, their expectations so alien. Could they truly bridge that gap? "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Zavanna nodded, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with determination. "I am." Dran took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Then let's take it slow, one step at a time." Zana's lips curved into a faint smile. "I would expect nothing less from you, Dran." As they stood together in the soft glow of the Verigan crystals, the fragile thread between them grew stronger. It was a tentative, uncertain bond, but it was real. And for the first time, both of them felt the possibility of something extraordinary. Zavanna and Dran's relationship deepened in the weeks that followed, what began as a tentative exploration of touch, and, for that, I am eternally grateful. They sat in silence for a long time, the stars bearing witness to their unspoken promises. When the day of Zana's departure arrived, Dran stood at the edge of the clearing where her ship awaited. Zavanna approached him, her expression calm, but her eyes betraying the depth of her emotions. "Goodbye does not mean the end," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. Dran nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Goodbye, Zana." She leaned in, her cool lips brushing against his cheek. A gesture she had learned was a human sign of affection. Then, without another word, she turned and ascended into her ship. As the vessel disappeared into the sky, Dran felt a mix of sorrow and hope. Zavanna had changed him, just as he had changed her. And though their paths had diverged, their bond would remain, a testament to the power of connection, even across the vast chasm of stars. Epilogue. Months later, Dran received an unexpected transmission. It was Zana, her face appearing on his console with a radiant smile. "I've secured permission to return to Earth," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Our work, our connection, is far from over." Dran grinned, his heart soaring. "I'll be waiting." And so their story continued. Two beings from different worlds, bound by a love that defied the odds. Together, they proved that true connection knows no boundaries, no matter how vast the distance or how different the individuals. It was a bond forged not in similarity, but in understanding, respect, and a willingness to bridge the divide.